Hello! Are you ready for today's fun little art lesson? Today we are going to experiment with our watercolor paints. Although if you don't have watercolor paints, feel free to get some markers. I personally would choose lighter markers, but today is going to be all about experimentation. It's going to be all about seeing what we have, what it does. So for other art classes that I teach, I paint a specific thing and then I gather the tools that I need and the supplies that I need to create that specific thing. Well, when we're using what we have to come at it from a different approach. What we are going to do is we're going to get the things that we have and we're going to try some different things and see what they do and then create from there. So it's kind of like our field research for our project that we're going to do. So the first thing, gather your supplies. So watercolor paints, I have a little bit of a mess so I can't quite close them, but you know, little praying watercolor paints. I have this kind of watercolor paints too. Just get what you have. If you don't, and then of course our less, you know, like not a fancy brush. We're not using fancy things. Any brush will work. We're seeing what we have does. So just gather what you have. The same murky water from yesterday. It'll be fun to see how this evolves over the next couple of weeks, huh? Oh, look, it's also a science experiment. Anyway, so if you're using watercolors, also get water and a brush. If you don't have watercolor paints, and again, we're just using watercolors, steer clear from acrylics. If you have some of those craft acrylics, we'll be using those late in a different lesson. Those aren't really what we're working with today. If you don't have watercolors, get some markers. I don't think colored pencils or crayons will work the same way because they're waxy. So in later steps, that could be difficult to work with. But then once you have your colored media, we're also going to need our ink pens, a black ink pen, ballpoint pen, ultra fine tip Sharpie. These G2s will work, but keep in mind what we discovered the other day. These are water soluble, so these are permanent. Again, not good or bad, just like note to self and be observing what happens when we overlay these things. Okay, so that's the colored media. For papers, grab a book page, any leftover brown paper bag scraps. I have cardstock. I have office paper. All right. That's, I think, oh, newspaper. If you have some newspaper, you could even grab some of that. Like I said, we're just seeing what happens when we use all these different tools and supplies together. That's what we're gonna do. So, come on down, Alice. The first thing I think I'm going to work on some cardstock. And what I wanna do is talk a little bit about colors, color mixing, and seeing what happens. So, this is a color wheel. Colors opposite of each other on the color wheel make poopy caca. That's not bad, it's just a fact. Sometimes if you're painting a tree, sometimes you need a dark color. If you're painting a pebble or a stone, you need to know how to make those neutral, unattractive colors. So I just want to put that out there because what we're going to do right now is we're going to see how these colors act next to each other. We're going to see what happens when they're wet next to each other and what kinds of combinations end up being appealing to us. So I'm just going to start with some green. Now, these are all the basic colors, which are great. Sometimes you need the greenest green you can get. But there's a lot of variety in greens. When you look outside, when you see a tree, it's never just green. There's a million different greens in it. So what I like to do is I use this top part of my watercolor set as a color mixing tray. You could also use a yogurt container lid or a plate or whatever you have. But I'm going to start with just green. So for this experimental page, I think choose just a general shape that you like, whether it's a circle, blotches, stripes, rectangles. I always like circles because circles are known to be the friendly shape. So that's what my green looks like. But now what happens if I add a little blue to the green? And what happens if they touch right next to each other? They kind of blend together right there. Ooh, see, that's an interesting color to me. Again, because we're not working on watercolor paper, it is good not to use an excessive amount of water because it will really break down the paper. So I'm being pretty careful about how much water I'm using. So what happens if we now just drop bright little bits of green in there? Wet to wet? Maybe it's not wet enough. Sometimes it moves around. What if I pick up some yellow? So this is we're just experimenting right now. We're just seeing what happens when we do different things. And I'm having a really light touch. I'm not using a lot of pressure. Okay, so when it's wet, they blend together a little bit. When it's dry, they create two layers, the lighter part and the dots above. So let's keep going. Let's see what happens. What if we add a little orange to our blue-green? See what I'm talking? Oh, it's still greenish, but oh my word, I love that color. Oh, and you know what else I'm seeing? Because this blue shape was dry and this grayish shape overlapped, we're getting a layer. We can see. The wonderful thing about watercolors is they're translucent, so you can see things underneath. So I'm just going to keep going a little bit, and you can follow along, or you can go up to this pan. If you'll see, I'm making quite a poopy caca mess. Like that's not pretty there, but boy, it sure looks nice down here. Oh my word, I like that. What happens if I add a bright color into my dull green? Interesting. I can see it starting to ooze and spread like a pox. Too dark. Another thing that might be nice to have is a paper towel, I guess. Okay, so I'm gonna move to some more yellow tones. See what happens here with this. See what I think about a dull color next to a bright color. And as you're painting or as you're doing these swatches or color samples, just pay attention to what colors you are attracted to. Like, I really got excited when I saw this color. It kind of reminds me of a stone or a rock out in nature. I really like that. But let's see what other colors. I'm always a sucker for aqua. Let's see if my blues can make an aqua. Blue-green? Ooh, is that a peach? Wow, that's not different from what I've been doing. And don't worry if these get all messy. You can, once you're done, you can take a paper towel or something and kind of wipe those out if you want. What happens with this? Ooh, so that's a really intense color. Well, these ones are more washed out. That one's a little more intense. And look at what's happening right there as it bleeds into one another. That's kind of cool. I'm going to tuck that away in my mind memory. My memory bank, let's just keep painting. Okay, so, and you don't have to, yours doesn't have to be super orderly like this. You can, maybe I should stay away from, maybe I should move to different colors. What happens when we do orange with a little bit of purple? So with watercolors, there is no white. I'm guessing you've all noticed that. The way that you make things lighter or darker is by diluting it with water. So let's see what happens. What about a bigger shape? What happens if I fill in a bigger shape and then with just a plain wet brush, wet the edges? Just see what happens. Maybe I drag some out. Oh, now it's looking like a flower. That wasn't my intention, but since it's happening, it sure is an unattractive color for something as nice as a flower. But the other good thing about watercolors is they are super easy to overlap. What about purple and blue? What kind of color can I make with that? So this is just your experimental, your test run. You know, see what kinds of colors you can make. Even though I have all these colors, they can't make every color. Back to greens. I guess I like green these days. I used to be such a sucker for reds and aquas. Okay, so this is just one way to experiment. This is on some cardstock. Let's see what our paints do on book pages. And maybe this time I'm going to use stripes. I'm just going to use one page. Again, this paper is delicate, so not a whole lot of water. Oh, and maybe I will vary my stripes. Maybe now I will make some skinny orange. Ooh. So as it dries, I'm noticing that these tones are getting quite a bit more, less vivid, less bright. Okay, so like we did in this one, let's see what happens when we put wet colors right next to wet colors. Can we drop some colors in there? What happens when we do put a little red in that wet? Will it blend like it did on the other paper? Okay, so there's some on that kind of a paper. Once you have your swatches, here I've done some stuff on some brown paper bag. Because of the brown of the paper, my tones, even though like this green was really intense, it was mostly pigment and it wasn't even diluted with hardly any water. So look at how vivid that appears here on the brown paper. But as it dries and as the brown of the paper dullens the color, it becomes less intense. So these are other good things to observe. Here's some, let's see what happens with markers. Now markers, technically these are water soluble, but what I noticed is that once they dry, they are not, when the, well that didn't mean to happen. Oh, but hey, happy accidents. That looks pretty cool. I like those colors together too, that pink and green. So but what I was trying to show you is when you just lay that color down, you can sort of activate it with water. But once it dries, you won't really be able to. So look what you can do. Even when you thought you didn't have watercolors, you kind of did. So, but let's see what happens after it dries. I don't think it will act the same way. We'll give it a second. And I just grabbed a few colors that I like together. Like when I was looking at my bag of markers, I saw this lavender next to this blue and this gray, and I was like, oh wow, that looks nice. But then again, I'm always a sucker for the neon pinks. Let's see what happens with a highlighter. Does a highlighter, oh no, it doesn't really activate with water. Okay, so let's see what happens with this marker. This was what happened when I added water to marker right after I laid it down. This marker, oh, still works. Huh. That's not what I expected to happen. Well, there you go. I thought, let's see what happens with this lavender. Is this oh, look at that. Oh my. Oh wow. Let's oh, look at how my brush is kind of flaying like that. That's making some interesting line qualities. All right. So what I'd like you guys to do is to experiment with different colors, how they act next to each other color-wise and wet into wet-wise. Which reminds me, what happens if I drop some ink into this? Will it blend like watercolors do? Doesn't look like it, but that looks pretty. Okay, so once you have your color swatches, and I have made a few, you know, the good news about working with not a lot of water is they dry really quickly. So, this is something that I was working on, kind of as a demo. The next thing I'd like to do is get out our ink pens. So what happens if we draw over this? I know what happens. It looks good. So I think for the sake of narrowing down our subject matter so we can really fully explore the media, we should stick with plants. Let's draw plants. Now, you can use your imagination. You can look at the way leaves and plant shapes are in magazines, or you can look outside or look at a plant in your house. But what I like to do, and what I think is a fun way to use what we have, is we have these watercolory shapes and we have pens. So we don't have to, well, let me say this again. Our pens do not have to follow the rules of our color. We can use the line of the pen independently from the color blotches. So let me show you what I mean. Instead of going around each edge of the color like that, I am going to draw my botanical shapes and not really worry too much about how the color is acting, right? So this is kind of like a little jade plant. Maybe there's a big one coming back here from behind. Pretty spindly for a jade plant. So now, even just in this little leaf, there's a dark part of the leaf and a light part of the leaf. Let's see what happens. And that's just one way. We just did all these swatches and samples. So you can use, you know, maybe if you have a layout like this, maybe you just have something small and patterned within your color shape, or maybe it crosses over. So it's still that same idea of those jade leaves. You know, maybe up here something is coming off the top of it. Maybe this is more like a spider plant. So today's lesson is really just an experiment in using color and line and all the different ways that you can use those. I kind of forgot any leaves down here. All right, I think I think that's it. So enjoy. I can show you some that I made. You can also go back into your watercolor. Sorry, Alice, I thought of something else. If you don't have an ink pen, you can do the same thing with watercolor. Because this is dry, they will be separate. If you've noticed when we were mixing wet to wet, those layers or those colors, when they're both wet, will merge. But when they're dry, if you don't have a pen, you can use your watercolor like that. I think the key to getting a delicate line with the watercolor is all about how much pressure you apply. This is me just barely touching the paintbrush to the paper. This is me applying full pressure. Your line can change thickness. Okay, I think that's it. So paint and draw away. And keep everything, because we're going to use these things always in something else. So keep what you do, show me what you do. I love seeing your guys' projects, and I'll see you tomorrow.